Well, we want to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the origins of CrossWay International Baptist Church. It's a momentous time celebrating the church's the church's 20th anniversary. And I guess we could say that the origins go back to even our childhood years. Becky and I, both in the churches that we grew up in, would be moved as missionaries would come and tell their stories. And, we weren't sure what to do with that as we moved through our high school years and even college years. Yeah, still a tenderness toward maybe actually leaving the U.S. and going overseas. But never really sensed for sure this is what the Lord had for us. And I'm going to fast forward ahead now. We're married. The year is 1998.
Living in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Yeah, I'm a youth and outreach pastor. Becky's serving alongside with me. And we take a mission trip with several of our teenagers to Kiev, Ukraine. And before we leave for this trip, one of the things that we had recommended that people in our church would do would be to write notes of encouragement for the leaders and the teens going on the trip. And so I actually got a note of encouragement from a friend in our church, a guy named Dave, kind of my accountability partner. So anyway, we're in now Kiev, Ukraine in the summer of 1998, and I open up a note from my friend back in Grand Rapids, and I'm not going to read all of it, but to this day, I've saved it, and here's what he said. Your trip to Kiev is a reminder to me of your desire to be on the foreign field. We talk about this being a time for the kids to evaluate their future ministry, but I see it as a time for you to evaluate. Then he writes, take some time today to reflect on where you have been, where you are, and where God has you heading. So I read that and I really took that to heart. I remember we were working with a church in Kiev to run a camp for children. And this camp was situated outside of Kiev, beautiful property, a pine forest. And I remember in the mornings I would get up and spend time before the camp started, before the children woke up, spending time with the Lord. And I was just praying about this. Lord, here we are in this new land. We're in Grand Rapids, Michigan, this city that has all these churches and radio stations and bookstores. There's such an abundance of gospel witness, and now we're here. What does this mean? And I remember that I sensed a prompting from the Lord to at least write a letter. This was back in the day before we had email readily available.
And kind of to just jump in here, Steve had been able to visit another country, India, right after college. But this was my first time, sadly, out of the United States. And so it was a great time for me too, just to see the needs that were outside. And like Steve mentioned, we were coming from a city like Grand Rapids, Michigan, where there were churches and at that time Christian bookstores and radio stations. And so it was great for me to be exposed and see what God was doing in other parts of the world.
Yeah, so write this. We felt prompted, I could at least write a letter to this guy named Paul Jackson, president of a mission organization. And so after that trip, got home and I obeyed that prompting, wrote that letter to him. And then the day after sending that letter, I received a letter from this individual in the mail. And he, in this letter, shared about this vision to start an international church in Berlin, Germany. So it's almost like when I read that, it's like the words just jumped off the pages of that letter. And it just resonated because there was a growing desire to maybe serve as a pastor, to lead a church, but also a growing desire to serve in missions. So the idea of starting an international church in a city like Berlin, it seemed like it would bring both of those loves together. And I remember in those critical months trying to determine, is this how the Lord is leading us or not? One of the verses that really meant a great deal was Acts 13:47. I have made you a light for the nations that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth. And of course, that is a theme verse that we have had before us throughout these years since we now have been in Berlin.
We just, sensed that maybe God was starting to release us from our ministry there in Grand Rapids. And I think that's an important aspect. Before God calls you somewhere else, you need to be busy where you are serving Him. And so it was neat just how we saw scripture that kind of was prompting us to maybe take this step forward. Circumstances, one circumstance that really stood out to us was the fact that when we decided to put our house on the market there in Grand Rapids, it sold within an hour. And then we had confirmation from people. Now it took a while, but initially our church family there in Grand Rapids wasn't too happy about us leaving their congregation and going somewhere else. But Steve was sitting in a meeting one time, and a dear friend, as he was hearing this idea, finally said, okay guys, we've just got to, get on board here, because remember the story of Jonah? That ship, started going down in the storm when Jonah wasn't being obedient. And so, hey, we've got to get these people out of here and kind of throw them off the boat if that's what they're really supposed to be doing. So
then finally in the next year, summer of 1999, we took an exploratory trip to Berlin. And it wasn't as though we necessarily loved everything about Berlin and the prospect of moving here, but there was that sense of this is what the Lord has for us. It was quite evident. And now we're kind of fast forwarding ahead. We went back from that survey trip sensing this is what the Lord had for us. And then we began raising support. And by the spring, May of 2001, the family moved to Berlin, Becky and I, and at that time, 4 kids, Ashley, David, Isaac, and Abby. What was that like for you as mom?
Yeah, it was interesting. I can remember distinctly walking down the street, trying to kind of get oriented. The kids probably had a lot of ice cream at that point because that's one of those little shops we found. But people would just say, eins, zwei, drei, vier, Kinder. So a family with 4 kids was pretty unique.
And I just remember someone said, what are you going to do back in Grand Rapids? What are you going to do when you get to Berlin? And I said, I think I'm going to get the family settled in our apartment. And I knew from a visit previously that there was a store across the street from our apartment. So I said, I think once we get settled in the apartment, I'm going to walk across the street and buy a coffee maker and buy some German coffee and make my first cup of coffee and just look out the window and just dream regarding what God has for us. And that's exactly what I did my first day in Berlin. And then before we left, someone else asked, well, what else are you going to do? And I said, I don't know what it's going to look like. And I had my day timer. And
Still has his day timer.
After all these years, I still use my trusty day timer. And honey, the day we actually flew out was when?
May 8th, 2001.
Yeah, so, you know,
Landed on May 9th.
April, jam-packed full, May 1st through 7, all these things. And I got to May 8th, and it was blank. Nothing in that day timer from May 8th on.
When we first got here, Steve had secured a temporary apartment for us up in kind of more the northwest part of the city, not far from the old Tegel airport. And so we all know transitions are hard, right? It just takes a while to get oriented. And there were a few days when, just life in the new city to us, Berlin, just seemed difficult. And I remember I would take the kids to the park because they were little. Abby was 1, Isaac was 3, Dave 5, Ashley 7. So take them to the park and let them play on the playground. And as they were playing and having fun, I would sit there and watch airplanes soar off into the sky there from Tegel Airport, and just would wish sometimes that I was going back on one of those planes.
So soon after we arrived in Berlin, you know, it begins to dawn on you, we're here to plant a church. And it was such a faith-stretching experience to raise the support and finally come to Berlin. That was our focus prior to this for several months, over a year as a matter of fact. And then you come here and you realize we actually have to see a church planted in this very exciting but very secular city. And there was just this sense, okay, just as God brought us this far to raise this money so that we could come here, now we can trust Him to begin bringing people in to actually see a church formed.
And it was really exciting to see how God would do that, and in ways that we would never have comprehended or thought about. But that time, that first summer of 2001, we started attending the German church that Aaron and Anna Bose were pastoring. And so it was great. You know, you could hear German language, get to meet some people. But one Sunday while we were there, a young woman came up to me after the service and started talking to me. And you would all know her, Mandy Kappa. Mandy was one of the first people that we met here that expressed interest in an international church. And as we started a Bible study in our home in July of 2001, she was one of the first people to regularly attend that Bible study.
And that Bible study was another faith-building experience because, again, you're thinking, okay, we're here now and a church has to be planted. And so that's how we believe the Lord, that's what we believe the Lord had for us, was to start with a Bible study in our home. And we had a retired couple who came over shortly after we arrived to come and serve us by watching our kids so that we could go to language school. And they were so helpful. Dan and Jean.
Provided lots of encouragement.
Yeah, Dan and Jean O'Dean. They were the core of our Bible study. It was Steve and Becky and Dan and Jean. And then, as Becky mentioned, Mandy soon joined us. But that was really about it. I remember I would go up to the top floor of our apartment and look down, pace back and forth, and try to pray in, Lord, would you send anyone else to this Bible study? And eventually there was a man who was a scientist from Novosibirsk, Siberia, who needed housing, and he stayed with us, and he started coming to our Bible study. So now we're up to 4 people, and then a young man, American Polish man, joined us. That was, I guess, we were up to the 2 of us, and Dan and Jean, and Mandy, and Alexander, and then this guy. And so little by little, one person at a time, the Lord put together a little Bible study that became really the core of the church plant back in those early days. So we're moving along by God's grace with this Bible study, but one of the real blessings was there were some other American missionaries sort of waiting in the wings to join us. And so we move into the fall, and then we get into the winter of 2002, January of 2002, the Good family, Fritz and Lynette Good and their 4 daughters joined us. And then later on, there was another family, the Peterson family joined us. And then also Bruce and Marnie Brandenburg were part of that team in those early days. This was still before Christie's time. But then it was that spring, April 14, 2002, when we held the first service of what would be CrossWay International Baptist Church.
You know, it really didn't take us long at all to realize the importance of our kids in ministry. That's become a lot of our philosophy, is that you don't do ministry in a vacuum just as adults, but you involve your whole family and do it together and pull them in. And so there at the first service, we had at least these 13 kids, I think ages 16 and under. We're just a vital part. Brittany Good, at that point in time, was doing the transparencies that we would show on the wall so that we could have the words to the Psalms. She and her sister Brianna had a heart to kind of get a youth group started. And so that was part of where they threw their time and energy. Steve and I realized just how special it was to be able to do things with your kids. And so we are just very thankful for the impact that these kids had back at the beginning. It takes a crowd to draw a crowd. And so when people would walk in and visit the church, they would see these kids there already. And so that was helpful as families would and other people would come and visit.
John 5:24, Jesus says, whoever hears my words has crossed over from death to life. So right away, the thought was this has to be about Jesus and keeping the centrality of any message that we are communicating on the gospel, the good news that God saves sinners through Jesus. And so really that's the heart even behind the name CrossWay, this idea of crossing over from death to life in Jesus, and this idea that it's all about the presence of God. So the story of CrossWay, of course, is God's story, and we're just a small part of that.
We are Fritz and Lynette Good, and we have 4 daughters, Brittany, Brianna, Brooke, and Brielle. And we wish we could be with you today in person, but unfortunately, due to a family circumstance, we are unable to leave the States and travel overseas.
I never thought that I would be a part of a permanent job as a pastor. We got an opportunity in 1993 to go to Russia. And in that, we had to have 3 major prayer requests. One was I needed to get a year's leave of absence as a police officer. That had never happened, has not happened in almost 80 years. And so God moved in my superintendent's heart to answer that. While we were in Russia, God got a hold of our heart, and we began praying about full-time service for the Lord. I retired on a Friday from the state police, and on a Tuesday we got on a plane to fly to Germany.
We left on January 15th, 2002 to move to Berlin, Germany. Our daughters at the time were ages from 15 down to 4, and the Lord allowed us to spend almost 15 years in Berlin, helping to serve alongside of Steve and Becky Dye at CrossWay Church, planting and establishing this great work in the heart of Berlin.
While we were there in Germany, the different things that I did there was multitudes of different things because we were such a small staff. So I did a lot of things. One of those, I don't know if Steve will remember, is I led the church in worship one Sunday. And if you know me, that's pretty funny. Nothing that I've ever done before, but we did a lot of things that we just needed to do, Steve and I did. And but one of the things where my heart was doing counseling. I love doing counseling. How does God's Word apply to each and every person's life? Another thing, we started the youth ministry. Started the youth ministry with my 2 oldest daughters, and we had a total of 5 people that came for each and every week, and that's where the youth ministry started out of. And then we did a ministry to Poland. There was a church in Poland that asked for service if somebody would come along and minister with them. And Steve answered that, and after that we spent probably once a quarter we went to Poland. We did things like build a volleyball court there. We also did English day camp like that is done in Germany. And in that camp, Christy and I would go over there and teach English, and it was just a true joy ministering to the Polish people.
Some of the roles that I had at CrossWay were I was there when we started the women's ministry and greatly enjoyed the Wednesday morning women's Bible study. That led into some special events, and particularly one that was memorable was our yearly ladies retreat. And I enjoyed helping to plan and implement that event. Came alongside of Fritz and our daughters as they started the youth group, and I was a youth leader then for many years, almost until the time we left Berlin. But some of the greatest joys also that we remember is we started the Awana program, and our daughters went through the Awana program, became leaders in the Awana program, and through the Awana program, we had many families that came to CrossWay, and their children were able to benefit from a real systematic way of learning the Word of God and having fun doing so. While I was in Berlin, I started volunteering at an organization called Alabaster Jar. It's an outreach to the prostituted women on the streets of Berlin in the red light district. And I was outreach coordinator and then became the director. So I served this ministry for 10 years while there in Berlin. But I would have to say some of my fondest memories are when we received teams from our Sent Church, Harbor Shores, or supporting churches to Berlin, and we did English day speaking camps. It was such a great joy to have children and families from the community come to the church to meet different youth, and then oftentimes the English speaking day camp, then those same people came back to visit and to join CrossWay, and some of you there today are there at CrossWay because you attended our English speaking day camp. So we have great memories of those summers when we participated.
We also did the basketball camp. Frank Ewart and I, we started the basketball camp, English basketball camp there, and had an opportunity to minister and share the gospel with so many people in Berlin.
So there's some of the roles that we did, and it was a great ministry, and our family benefited greatly from living in Berlin, from being a part of a ministry with such wonderful people, and having the opportunity to plant this great work. We are praying for you, praying that the Lord will continue this great work for many, many more decades, and hopefully we'll be able to make our way over there before too long to see and greet you there in person. Thank you again for your work. Bye.
We thank you, and we enjoyed it, the years there, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Greetings, CrossWay family. I'm seated out here in front of the building that is currently known as CrossWay Church, because I wanted to tell a little bit of my story and how I ended up here. In 2004, I moved to Berlin to serve with this church, and at that point we were already here in the Hüttenweg facility, even though the church did start in Wilmersdorf. So yeah, by April of 2004, when I arrived in Berlin, I arrived to this building here. And I just wanted to tell a little bit about why I came to Berlin and then what God did in the years after my arrival. I knew I was called to be a missionary at around age 9 or 10. And in high school, I took German in high school thinking, yeah, it had no relevance to my future, but it totally did, of course. God is always working things out behind the scenes that we know nothing about. In Bible college, then, I met my first ever missionaries to Europe. I had never heard of missionaries to Europe. Whenever I thought of missionaries, I thought of Asia, Africa, South America, and yet Europe, I learned in college, was a very spiritually dark place in need of the light of the gospel. And God really used that fact and a quote about Germany, which I'll quote for you here in a moment, to completely change the direction when I thought about missions to that of Western Europe. I read a quote when I was 18 years old in Bible college that said, "Germany, at the heart of Europe, is without a heart for God. 98% is unreached and unsaved. The land of the Reformation is in need of regeneration." And God used that quote to cause me to, for the first time, think about Germany and tell God, I remember telling God, God, if you could use me to make it 97%, I'll go. And after that point in time, took a missions trip to southern Germany, and later on chose a mission agency in America and raised financial support, which took a couple of years against the diminishing dollar and the rising euro. And then finally in April of 2004, I was able to move over here. And I remember sitting just in the backyard here of this building, in the backyard where the stone tables are, with Steve Dye when I was 26 years old. And he said to me, "Christy, what do you see your role being here at CrossWay?" And I remember just having that conversation with him, and he asked me, "Do you want to work with women's ministries?" And I said, not primarily, no. And he said, "Well, what about, little kids?" And I said, I love kids, but I'm not sure, that's a specific passion right now. And And I said, Steve, is there anything this church really needs? And he said, well, we really could use a youth director. And I said, yeah, that lines up with my passions. So for the first 17 years here in Berlin, I got to be this church's youth director, and I cannot describe what a tremendous privilege that was to work with hundreds of teenagers coming from all over the globe that were living here in Berlin and get to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with those teens. It was an amazing job. Now I am privileged to just be still here working at CrossWay, mostly with interns, as I train interns for missions. Basically my heartbeat now is to train young people to do exactly what I did when I was a young person, which is give their lives to Christ, give it all to Christ, and serve Him for as long as He asks them to and wherever He asks them to. That is my heartbeat right now, and it has been a privilege to be here at CrossWay Church and work with the past staff of CrossWay in the early days and the current staff of CrossWay, and who knows, God only knows, maybe even the future staff of CrossWay. But CrossWay Church, I love you. Thank you.